Italy in 15th, 16th century. And we had ways of regulating and organizing ourselves into companies. The early companies were called joint stock companies, but these are basically ways to create an environment in which people can do business with each other with some level of certainty that things will go smoothly. You didn't have to, this meant you didn't just have to trust and know personally the people you're doing business with, because there's laws and rules and regulations that govern all of this. We learned to make physical stuff with much greater precision, so we invented machine tools that could measure stuff and slice it and dice it, wood and metal. Standards for something as simple as screws and threads. And this allowed us to build machines which were basically things that amplified the strength of our bodies, allowed us to do things we could never do before. Steam engines, railways. I started talking about airlines. And that, of course, before the airlines, the railways came in. They had the same kind of problems. Let's take something very simple. Time. I talked earlier about how we have to agree on what time a plane takes off and what time it leaves. Before the railways came along, there was no agreement. Every village and every town had its own time. I'm talking now primarily in Europe, so there would be a church in the middle of the village or whatever, and you would stand there and you'd look up, and when the sun was directly overhead, that would be 12 o'clock midday in your village. And if you go 1 mile to the east, you are off by, I forget what the number is, 17 miles to 1 minute. So if I go 17 miles to the east, then the time is off by 1 minute. In the days when people traveled by horse or on foot, this didn't matter. In a day you could only go 20 miles. So, you know, the place you end up, the time is off by a minute from where you started from. It really doesn't matter. With the railways, it was a different matter. In a day, you could go 100, 200, 300 miles. If you go north and south, that's okay, sort of. If you go east and west, it's not. But originally, the railway timetables were a complete mess because, as I suggested with the airline timetables, you could never tell whether the time that the thing departed was measured in the time of the city where it started from, or in the time of the city where it was going to end up. So after a little while, the railway company said, this is crazy, we need standard time. Everybody's got to be on the same time in England, otherwise none of our railway systems will work, so they standardized the time itself. And of course, since then, we've invented time zones and so on, and we're now kind of used to the idea, but this all came out of the railways. It's all ultimately about interchangeable parts. We go back to the railway engine again. If this engine is 100 miles from home and the axle breaks or the wheel breaks and you want a replacement, if it was a horse and cart, no big deal. You go down to the blacksmith or whatever, he'd hack something together for you. But when it's a railway engine, that doesn't work. You've got to have stores of parts, and they all have to be manufactured to the same precision, the same specifications. Otherwise, you just can't repair your engines and you can't keep your railway system going. So this started out, there was a guy called Eli Whitney in the United States, and shortly after the American Revolution he went to the new American government and said, I can build you muskets out of interchangeable parts. Before that, they were one-off. Everyone was different, every piece was handmade, and you could not take one piece, one gun apart and take a piece from it and put it into another because they were different. He said, I can manufacture them with machine tools so that they are all identical, and that way we can produce them much faster and they will be interchangeable. It's actually not, nobody's really sure historically whether he succeeded in doing this, but he convinced the American government that he could, and he is responsible for propagating, publicizing the idea of manufacturing things from interchangeable parts. That led to mass production. Henry Ford's production line in Dearborn, Detroit, where he's producing Model T Fords, and so on. So, okay, we talked about kind of social stuff and early industrial stuff. Let's go into computer age, which didn't start 20 years ago, or 30 years ago. Let's think about Blaise Pascal, the philosopher, 1649, created a mechanical calculator. Brass and wheels and stuff, and carries and so on and so on. Leibniz, also a famous philosopher, a little later created a mechanical calculator based on Pascal's. Pascal got a patent for that. Leibniz created one. Leibniz is more famous for the big duel he had with Isaac Newton over who invented the calculus. Each of them independently came up with it. At the end of the day, it seems Newton was a little bit ahead of Leibniz, but to compensate for that, ultimately the notation that we use for calculus was that defined by Leibniz rather than Newton. Jacquard loom, punch cards. I talked earlier about I started with punch cards. They originally were used for weaving cloth, invented by this guy called Jacquard. This is him talking to Napoleon, showing off his machine. And these were basically big, they were made of wood, I think, with holes drilled in them. And there was a reader thing with pins that would measure them. You may have seen a player piano that uses the same principle. And this way you could encode a design and control the looms. This is a portrait of Jacquard, which people, when they saw it hung on a wall, thought was actually an oil painting. It's not. It's woven in silk, and it took apparently 24,000 punch cards to define this image. That tells you something right there, that back then they hadn't invented the subroutine and they hadn't invented the loop, because if you had, you wouldn't have needed 24,000 cards. You would be define particular patterns and you would reuse them and so on. But nevertheless, the very first use of punch cards was in weaving. In England in the 18th century, excuse me, 19th century, early middle 19th century, there was a guy called Charles Babbage. He owned a copy of this portrait. So that was probably partly what inspired him to use punch cards for this engine that he invented. The intent of this was to calculate numbers which would be used for the tables that they use for navigation at sea. There were all these tables, they had to do these logarithmic calculations, and they had to be done by hand by what they then called computers, which were not machines but were human beings. Computers were people who sat down and did stuff on pieces of paper. And he said, I can figure out a mechanical way of doing this. He designed this machine. It's all brass wheels and cogs, and it has a printer and memory storage and so on. He never built it because he was a much better idea man than he was a manager, as many of us are. And plus, he always, before he finished one idea, he said, I know how to make this better. You probably met programmers like that who never finish anything, right? You get halfway through and say, I remember now, if I adopt this new library or this new style, then it's going to be twice as fast, and you never finish. So he was a bit like that. But to celebrate the 200th anniversary of his birth, which was 20, 30 years ago, the Science Museum in London took his blueprints and built a copy of this machine. They found a couple of bugs, but apart from that, it worked. And if you go to London, you can see it there. There's also a second copy now at the Computer History Museum in Mountain View in Silicon Valley. It's a wonderful machine to look at. Now this was, strictly speaking, was a calculator and not a computer, but one of the reasons he didn't finish this was he designed in his head and on paper what he called an analytical engine, which was a more general purpose programmable computer. That was never built. But how many of you heard of Ada Lovelace? One, good. Okay, she can claim to be the first programmer. There was a book that he put together to describe his analytical engine. She was a buddy of his, and they collaborated, and she described in this book, she actually had a program for calculating Bernoulli numbers. More importantly though, she, better than he, recognized that this engine that he had imagined in his mind was truly a general purpose computer. It wasn't just designed to do a particular task like his calculating machine, but it could perform any task at all. We'll come back to that. Anyway, she got a programming language named after her, Ada, which is still in use, I think, in the military. Let's move on a little. Here's another early calculating machine designed by Alan Turing, who I'm sure you've heard of. This is the machine that he used to break the Germans' Enigma code during the Second World War. But Turing is more commonly known for his notion of a universal Turing machine, that is, a general-purpose abstract machine that can solve any problem at all. Well, that sounds familiar, right? 100 years before, Ada Lovelace had come up with this idea. In fact, Turing, in his original paper on the Turing machine, did quote Lovelace. Of course, if you want to move beyond mechanical calculators, you need electricity. Probably the very first standards war, this is Tesla here in his laboratory. This is a composite picture. He's not actually sitting under that thing. But anyway, the first standards war was between Tesla, who was promoting the distribution of electricity as alternating current, and Edison, who was promoting it as direct current. Tesla won, but Tesla won the war in as much as we all use alternating current now, but of course Edison was a more practical man and he made the bucks. That led to the invention of the telegraph, the telephone, telecommunications, the very first international standards body. Today it's called, still exists, called ITU. Today it stands for International Telecommunication Union, but in the original version in 1860-something, 1865, it was called International Telegraph, or maybe Telephone and Telegraph, probably just Telegraph Union. And it existed, it was formed in order to define the protocols by which these machines will exchange information. Because if you don't agree on the protocols, you have nothing at all. Okay, standards are not just about technical stuff like this. We have standards in the real world, everyday life, such as beer. Governments like to tax alcohol. So if I'm selling stuff that is brown and frothy, can the government tax it? Well, they have to know whether it is alcoholic or not. So in the United States,